Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming tonight. I just have a few housekeeping items to go over before we start. Over on that table, there's a handout that has a list of books and some of the lighthouse keepers that will be talked about today. There are also some flyers for some upcoming adult programs at the library. We have some evaluation forms that if you have time tonight after the program ends, if you could fill it out and let us know what you liked, what you didn't like, what other programs you'd like us to do in the future. Those really help us plan programs for you. We also have some cookies that you're free to enjoy during the program. About in the back hallway there, we have 2 bathrooms. You're free to use whatever you want. And then tonight's program is expected to go to 7, probably a little bit past. The library closes at 7, so you'll just have to make sure you're going to leave through those back doors. This door will be locked since the library will be closed after 7. Yep, you'll exit through there. Yeah, and so from that, I'll turn things over.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you for having me here. It is Michigan Women's History Month, so this is why this program is of particular interest to me tonight, and a great one for libraries to bring in. How many of you knew that Michigan has more lighthouses than any other state? Did you know that? Wow, you guys are smart. You must have paid attention in school. I'm impressed with that. So we do. We have more miles of freshwater coastline than any other state, more lighthouses. Now, that number varies depending on who you ask. I put it around 125 to 129, and that includes active lights, non-active lights, even those ones that just look like hot water heaters at the end of the pier, because we have a handful of those that aren't very attractive, but they're still navigational aids for guiding maritime traffic. So before we get started, I want to put a trivia question out there. Who do you think is the most famous, well-known female lighthouse keeper in the world? She's not from Michigan, but just to throw that out there. Anybody have any wild guesses on who the most famous female lighthouse keeper in the world is? When I put her picture up here, you're all going to go, oh, it makes sense. It is the Statue of Liberty. So she is a navigational aid for mariners, and she's a woman. So the Statue of Liberty, that's a nice little tidbit here, a gift from France, dedicated in 1886. I don't want to do the math on how old she is, but she's been around a minute, right? If you did not get a chance to pick up the flyer on the side table over there, it has a list of all of the female keepers that I've been able to track down over the last 20, almost 30 years that I've been researching lighthouses in Michigan. I actually got hooked on them back in the late 1990s. And from that, drew 2 really key areas where I found interest. One was the haunted lighthouses, and I have a book on that. I actually presented on that a few years ago here. And the other was the female keepers. And what was fascinating to me about these female keepers was these were government jobs. So if you were a lighthouse keeper, it was a government position. So if you think about the first woman in Michigan to get this job working for the government was 1849. You think about that. Isn't that incredible? So they were working alongside men, often if it was their husband or their father or their brother who had the job, and then if they passed away, they would take that job on. Another interesting thing, like the only other job that a woman could have in the government back then was if you were the postmistress. You know, you could have that position, but mostly they didn't. Now, lighthouse keepers back in the 1800s, men would earn, depending on where the lighthouse was located, particularly in the Great Lakes region, about $350 to $450 a year. Now, not a lot. I need to do the equation to figure out what that would be today, but you think that they also had their house provided to them. They didn't have to buy, build, rent a house, so they had that. Everything they needed to run that house was also provided to them. They worked 24/7 from like April to December, so they didn't have a lot of time to go travel and do a lot of stuff. So it really wasn't horrible. A lot of them also had other jobs to supplement that. Now, what do you think the women made if they came on as a lighthouse keeper in the 1850s? 100. You think they made 100 if a man made 450, 350? Sounds about right. Well, they actually made the exact same as men. Isn't that amazing? I don't know what happened along the way. Something. Sorry. But like they made the same. So you can go back through the records and you can see that when if a male keeper had a job at a light and he passed away and his wife took the job, that it will show the salary as the same amount. So, I mean, hearing these types of stories is what really inspired me with these female keepers. So, we're not going to get to obviously all of them on the list. Otherwise, all I would be doing is reading the list. But we're going to make our way. We're going to start in Southwest Michigan on Lake Michigan. We're going to make our way north and we're going to hit Lake Superior and we're going to come back down through Lake Huron. And we're going to start at White River Light Station in Whitehall, where there were actually a couple of women who were tied to this lighthouse. But the one I want to introduce you to tonight is Frances. So Frances and her husband Leo came in the 1940s to White River Light Station. By this point, the U.S. Lighthouse Establishment, which was the federal branch of the government that appointed and dealt with lighthouses, in those earlier years, the president actually appointed these lighthouse keepers. I love it when I come across ones that Abe Lincoln appointed these people. I always think that's so cool. In the 30s, they started to transfer to the Coast Guard, and that's where Leo Worry comes in. He was from the UP. He and his wife Frances move in. They're taking care of the light, and he's only there for a couple of years, and he decides very early on two things. One, he's really not liking and cut out for being a lighthouse keeper, and two, he doesn't like being married. So he divorces her and moves to the UP and takes a job at a very historic establishment up near Marquette called the Huron Mountain Club. Has anybody ever heard of this place? As a quick aside, the Huron Mountain Club was a private club, still exists. It is so exclusive that Henry Ford was denied membership because he was new money and it had to be only old money. And it's still there. Now, I just heard that so he ended up buying property next to it, which I heard just went up for sale. And so now my boyfriend's trying to figure out how to pay for it. I'm like, I don't think we have $4 million to buy Henry Ford's property on Lake Superior, but whatever. But they were going to put a road through here on Mountain Club, and Henry Ford got it stopped. And so then, of course, he was valuable to them. And then anyway, little side history. So after Leo leaves, Frances applies for and is granted the job as the lighthouse keeper. Now, she doesn't even make the $350 a year. I don't know what happened by the time we got in here, other than it was after the Depression, but she was making pennies compared to what they made back in the 1800s. But she loved her job. She was here for about 8 or 9 years, and she ended up getting remarried and having a daughter. And when she had her daughter, she ended up retiring from this service and stayed in the area, but took in another job. But one of the great things that I learned, and I met her once, in 1953, she was actually on the game show What's My Line? Anybody familiar with that show? They sent her to New York, and the premise for the show, if anybody's not familiar, is they bring her in. There's a panel of 3 celebrity judges, and they have to ask yes or no questions to try to figure out what her job is. And every time she says no, she earns, I think it's $10, $5, maybe it's $5. She earns $5. So she ends up winning the show. She gets must have been 5 because she got $50 was her prize. $50. That's all. Which was actually probably equivalent to her year's salary at that point. But they got as close as guessing that she was a government employee, but who's going to guess, even in 1950s, that there's still active lighthouse keepers out there? If you go on YouTube, you can search for this. The video is out there. It's from May of 1953. It is the episode that also features Mickey Mantle, but she's the first one brought out. So in the first 12 minutes of the show is dedicated to her. And it's really kind of cool to see that. I met her probably 15 or more years ago. She and I both spoke at an event in the Whitehall area. And she talked about how she loved the job. She had a couple times where she had to swim out to save people that got caught in the undertow, because that was part of her job description as well. She had nothing good to say about that husband who left her, which was really funny. She was just spunky. That's the word I would use to describe Frances. And she lived into her 90s. She passed away maybe 10 years ago now. Standing next to her is Karen McDonald, and Karen actually became the caretaker of this lighthouse, the White River Light Station in Whitehall, from the 1980s until about 2014, 2018, I think, when the lighthouse was transferred in its ownership. So before we got started earlier, we were talking a little bit about islands. Anybody ever been out to South Manitou Island? Wow, 2 of us. That's sad. All right. Well, you maybe can take a ferry there from Leland. I don't know. The dock situation is not good out there, and there's a battle between the boat company and the national parks, which may or may not exist after this summer, to get out there. But if it holds up and you can go, I highly recommend it, especially if you like hiking and history. So during the 1800s, they actually had about 200 residents living out here on the island. They had a bunch of farmsteads. So you can see these are all farms. And many of them are still there. Like there's a few of the houses still there, some of the barns. They have a preservation group that's been rebuilding some of the old stone walls around these facilities. I was out there last summer. They are actually growing a variety of rye out there that's used for whiskey. They grew it in the 1900s, and they've early 1900s, and they've reintroduced it here in the last few years. So they also have, when you come in the main dock, there's a Coast Guard life-saving station, and then the lighthouse here itself. And this is a really tall light. I think it's 117 steps tall, and then attached to the house. You can go through the tower, but not the house. What's also interesting to note here is that this big harbor, this crescent-shaped harbor, is really deep, and it was a natural harbor. And so in the 1800s, when ships were coming through from Chicago, going through the Straits of Mackinac to Detroit or vice versa, if a storm came in from the west, which was most common, they could seek refuge in that harbor and be protected from the wind. Although, as you can see, several didn't actually make it. These are all shipwrecks off the coast of South Manitou. So the fact that this was a deep natural harbor, a lot of ships would come in that they sold cordwood that would go to the steamers to help fuel the steamers. The tower itself was really tall. So this was a really significant port. And the head keeper here for about 10 years was Aaron Sheridan. And he was a Civil War soldier, a veteran of the Civil War. Very common for veterans to be appointed as lighthouse keepers because it was a branch of the government. But Aaron actually had something interesting. He was injured in battle, and he lost the use of his left arm. All of the bones in his lower part of his left arm were shattered during a skirmish. And so he couldn't use that. Now, how many of you have actually climbed a lighthouse? Right? You use that left hand to hold on to that railing on your way up. So if he can't hold on to that, his balance is going to be a little off. His right hand is carrying a pail of hot whale oil or lard or whatever they were using at the time. Everybody's was different. So he's walking up there carrying this pail of hot oil to 118, 17, 18 steps to the top of that tower. And sometimes it was just too much for him. So he was able to get his wife, Julia, appointed as an assistant keeper, federally recognized. So he made about $350 a year. She, as an assistant, would have made about $150. In addition to doing that, she raised 6 sons while they were out there. Any of you who have all boys know what a handful that could be. She also would have been responsible for all the cooking and the cleaning. They would have had a farm, so they would have been growing their own vegetables, probably had a small orchard. They probably had a pig and a cow, maybe some goats, chickens. So she would have been helping with all of that. These women, I mean, we didn't even have the word multitasker back then, but that's what these women were. They were doing it all. So they are living at the light. He has other family out there. Things are great. And in mid-March of 1887, they had gone on a boat like this. There you can actually see how his left hand just hangs there. They had gone on a boat like this. This is an open-aired Mackinac sailboat. 1878, March 16th, and they had gone from the island over to Glen Arbor to the mainland. How many of you want to go in an open-aired sailboat in March across northern Lake Michigan? I need to call, like, the National Weather Service chronicles history of weather, and I want to find out what the conditions were like on this day. But the boat capsized on their return trip to the island. This other photo here, this is Christian Ankerson and his wife, but Christian was a fisherman from the island, and he was sailing the boat because Aaron couldn't sail with one arm. And Julia was busy with their 9-month-old son, Robert, who was with them. And the boat went down. Aaron, Julia, and Robert all perished. The boat ended up with the sails down into the water, and Christian climbed up on the bottom of the boat, feet dangling in the water, and that's where he hung on to for dear life until he was rescued later that night. This newspaper article is kind of the recap of an inquisition. These were government employees who lost their life on the job, and so they had to, they had to question Christian about what happened. And they determined it was a weather-related accident, and he was not held responsible for their deaths. But it was quite a tragedy for the island and for the Sheridan family. No bodies were ever recovered, but in 2008, the descendants of the family, who are big historians and genealogists, had these historical markers placed out in the cemetery on the island. I took these when I was out there about 5 years ago. This is a photo of the family, descendants of the family that worked for about 6 or 7 years to get these markers placed. You see, in the 1970s, the islands became part of Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore. And you can't just go putting up memorials in a cemetery on this property anymore because it's owned by the government. Well, it's owned by us, but run by the government. So it took years and years. They actually had to go through and get congressmen from Michigan to help them get this in place. And what they ended up finding out was that you are allowed to put veterans memorials in the national parks. And because Aaron was a Civil War soldier and a veteran, they were allowed to put his marker out there. And then with that came a marker for Julia and baby. Now, George Sheridan here, he was the second oldest son. He and his older brother Levi were actually in the tower of the lighthouse when that ship went down that afternoon and witnessed the whole thing. But he went on to become a lighthouse keeper himself because of that. He went there to do it in tribute to his parents. His wife, Sarah, assisted him. And he served for many years at lighthouses in southern Lake Michigan. And for 14 years, he was at the Kalamazoo River Light in Saugatuck, which is no longer standing. But he was actually the only officially trained lighthouse keeper here. In 1914, when the light was decommissioned, or right about the time, he actually checked himself into the Kalamazoo Asylum for what essentially would be depression. He just really struggled his whole life with what happened to his parents and never was able to bypass that. So he was institutionalized at the time the lighthouse was formally closed up, and so his wife Sarah took over those duties. She was never recognized by the government, but she was responsible for the final work on that. After that, he actually, George ended up losing his job in the service and went down to visit a relative who was keeping a light in Evanston, Illinois at Grosse Pointe Lighthouse, and he hung himself. It finally caught up with him. Now, the Sheridan family, interestingly enough, is the only lighthouse family featured in both of my books. So South Manitou Island Lighthouse is rumored to be haunted by the spirits of Aaron and Julia. We can hear cries that come from the causeway that connects the house to the tower. And my second book, Death in Lighthouses on the Great Lakes, about murder, suicide, and other deadly tragedies, has more detail on George's story from that part of southern Lake Michigan. So this is Sarah Lane. Let's make it a little bit lighter now. Sarah Lane and her husband John started out their career at what I consider to be the longest lighthouse name in the state of Michigan. The St. Clair Flats South Channel Range Lights. So they would have lived in the larger facility here, and they would have taken a rowboat. They said about 1,000 feet apart. So they would have taken a rowboat across, and every day they had to take care of both of these lights. And so they did that in tandem. They were there for a few years, and then they ultimately moved up to Traverse City, where they took charge of the Old Mission Point Lighthouse at the end of Old Mission Peninsula. Not long after they got there, John became bedridden or ill of something. And so Sarah really stepped up and took care of the lighthouse for many years. This article I love because this is from 1905. And I love the fact that the newspapers were paying attention to these jobs and the jobs that these women were doing. There were several articles of this time period about these female keepers. I guess they were just as fascinating to them back then as they are to us today. So this article talking about how she takes care of the light because John is ill. He actually passed away the next year, and she was formally appointed as the head keeper for a couple of years until she retired. But there's a great part of this article here at the bottom. It says, injured while attending light. And essentially, she tells this story about one night. So you've climbed a lighthouse tower, right? You know, when you get to the top, and you usually have like a little ladder to get you to the lantern room where the Fresnel lens is at. And it's got that metal floor, and you have that trap door that you open, and then you climb up to tend to the light. So she's doing this on one particular stormy night, except when she flings that door open, it doesn't go all the way open. And as she puts her hand there to climb all the rest of the way up, it comes down on her hand and basically chopped off part of a finger. But she doesn't realize it. And she's going about her business, and she's fueling it and polishing the lens and trimming the wick and getting it all, making it as bright as it can be so that the ships out there can know where the shore is and know where safety is. And she basically says that she eventually looks down and realizes that there's blood everywhere and realizes that part of her finger's gone. And she says, I should have fainted away, but I was dead set on getting my job done that I didn't worry about it. That's the kind of people we were dealing with, men and women particularly. I mean, this was a service industry. These people, many of them saw it as a calling to be a lighthouse keeper, much like a doctor, a police officer, or someone along those lines. And that, going into that haunted side of things, people ask me, why do I think so many lighthouses are haunted? And I think that's part of it, is that these people lived this life. They dedicated to it, and they're going to stay there in an infinity time, whether they're alive or not. So this is going to be one of my favorite little stories to tell. This is the St. James Harbor Light at Whiskey Point on Beaver Island. Anybody been to Beaver Island? Oh, seriously. Okay. I know you guys have a really nice little town here, but there's like this whole world of Michigan and all these islands and shorelines. You really should go explore them. Beaver Island's fun. You know where you want to be on Beaver Island? What day you want to be there? Next Monday. No, 2 Mondays from now. St. Patty's Day. Huge Irish population out there. That's on my bucket list to be. I don't know. Maybe I probably can't hang out on Beaver Island on St. Patty's Day. I bet it gets a little raucous out there. But anyway, in the 1850s, late 40s, 1840s and into the 1850s, the island actually wasn't inhabited by Irish then. It was inhabited by Mormons. And there was a gentleman by the name of James Strang, and he wanted to be the Brigham Young of the Midwest. He wanted to be the Mormon leader to end all Mormon leaders. He proclaimed himself king, brought his population to Beaver Island, took over the whole area. What was his was his, what was yours was his. He would just walk into the homes of people that lived there and take whatever he wanted. Nobody stopped him. And so he was out there during this time period until he was assassinated by his followers. Gee, I don't know what could have gone wrong. Anyway, fast forward to the 1860s. This is the lighthouse, and we see a photo here. This is keeper Peter McKinley, and he was the keeper in the mid to late 1860s. These are his daughters early on, Effie and Mary. And in his last few years of his service, he was so sick, and they were teenagers by then, that they helped out with the job. So they were kind of unofficial keepers, but the youngest ones that we had in Michigan. Now, lighthouse keeping was a family job, because what's the number one job of a lighthouse keeper? Keep the light on, right? It's not that hard. But so if he's sick or injured or has to go away for some reason, the family has to step up, or the assistant keeper in their family. There is no, I don't feel like going to work today. There's no close sign. There's no, bad weather. We're not going to operate. When it's bad weather, it's even more important that they're running. So there was also no time off, no vacation pay, no workman's comp, none of that. So the family always stepped up to help out, because if they didn't, the keeper would get fired. Then they would lose their salary. They would lose their home, and they're probably not going to get another job in the industry. So the family all knew, most people, most of these keeper families, everybody knew how to do the job, and they helped out accordingly. So 1869, Peter officially retires, and that's when Elizabeth Van Riper, Elizabeth Whitney was her birth name. She married a man by the name of Clement Van Riper. Now, Elizabeth, I've been tracking her family tree for about 5 years now. She wrote a biography in 1903, an autobiography called The Child of the Sea, and I have my most coveted possession in terms of a book is a first edition that I found online. It's also the most expensive book I've ever bought at $65. I'm gonna put a tracker in it, I think, and just in case it disappears. This was the version I had before that. One of those print-on-demand versions that aren't very nice. But I'm gonna use it because I have some notes in here. So a little bit of Elizabeth's backstory, and I actually wrote an article about her for Michigan History Magazine a couple of years ago, and have a presentation specifically on her. She was born on Mackinac Island. She spent a little time on St. Helena Island, which is the island just to the west of the Mackinac Bridge. But she grew up on Beaver Island, and in her book is called The Child of the Sea and Life Among Mormons. And she was there. Her father actually built the castle or the cottage that the king lived in, that King Strang lived in. Her father was a carpenter. But she and her siblings, she had 3 half brothers, witnessed what was going on with the Strang reign. And often they were sent away to live with relatives or family members off of the island at different parts of time because it was just so tumultuous on the island. And she talks about that in her book. It's kind of like, her book is so amazing. It's kind of like if Laura Ingalls Wilder lived on an island, northern Lake Michigan, in that time period. It has that kind of firsthand accounts. So she ends up, after Strang gets assassinated, the family all reconvenes back on the island. She gets married to Clement Van Riper at the age of 16. He's about 10 or 12 years older than she is. And in 1869, he's hired as the lighthouse keeper. And she kind of assists with him. He had moved from New York to Beaver Island because of his health. And so she really stepped up and helped out. And she talks about in her book how she'd always had a fascination for the water. She loved working in the lighthouse itself. And then so they're there for about 3 years. And then there's a tragic accident. Clement actually, as one of the responsibilities for a lighthouse keeper, he had to go and assist if there were incidents in the water. And so this ship called the schooner, the Thomas Howland, was sinking in the harbor. He had to take his rowboat out and try to save the crew. And in doing so, he lost his own life. And she talks about in her book how his body is never recovered, and only those who have gone through the same know what a sorrow it is to lose your loved one by drowning and never be able to recover the remains. She says it's a sorrow that never ends through life. And so at that point, she is distraught over the loss of her husband. She's trying to figure out how she's going to make a living and where she's going to live. And so she applies for and is named the lighthouse keeper. She gets married a few years later, marries a man by the name of Daniel Williams. And in 1884, when they complete a lighthouse in nearby Harbor Springs, she applies for a transfer and is brought in as the very first keeper of this light. And she serves here from 1884 until she retired around 1912 to 1914. There's some discrepancies in the years. Daniel was a photographer, and he had a local gallery in Harbor Springs. She never had children with either husband, but her and her husband Daniel were great musicians. They would have parlor parties in the lighthouse. They would host parties on the lawn. If you're familiar at all with Harbor Springs, this sits at the end of Harbor Point, which is a private, gated, no vehicle area. But she had befriended, and that's where like the Wrigley family has a place. The McCormick Spice people have a place. It's like old money. And so they became friends with all those folks and celebrated their love of music. When she retired, they actually she bought them a house in Charlevoix, right on the beach. and they lived there for over a dozen years. Then they moved to another smaller house in town as their age got up there and they needed assistance from a nurse. And they lived 25 years after retirement. It was amazing. Um, she had served 44 years between assistant and head keeper at those two lighthouses before she retired. Now, like I said, 25 years after retirement, they actually end up passing away within 24 hours of each other. Kind of like that scene in The Notebook. And they are buried together in the cemetery just south of Charlevoix. Her great nephew was the executor of her estate. In doing my research on her family, I was able to find like the deed when she bought that house in Charlevoix. I've done a bunch of, I found like her first husband's sister, 10 years after he dies, comes after her in probate, trying to get money out of her. And I have all those documents. Anybody that does genealogy, you know what when you find cool stuff like that, how exciting it is. So they're buried just south of town. For years, I have been trying to get Elizabeth inducted into the Michigan Women's Hall of Fame. I consider her the matriarch of keepers for women in the lighthouse industry here in Michigan. She served longer than any other woman in Michigan, and about the same as there was one other woman in Michigan City, Indiana, who served about the same amount of time as well. But she finally got inducted in December. So I got a chance to go to the ceremony in Detroit, and several of she didn't have children, but her half brothers' descendants, and then her husband Daniel's descendants. There were two of the great granddaughters that came to the ceremony, and I got a chance to meet them at that ceremony. So she finally got recognized. We were talking a little bit about this ahead of time. This is John Terry from Escanaba. He was hired in to be the head keeper of the Sand Point Lighthouse there. They completed the light in late 1867, and it was supposed to go into service on May 13th of 1868, but he died in between those two times. He died in April. And so his wife, Mary, was named the head keeper. And this we believe to be the only photograph of her standing on the lighthouse steps there. This, I think it was made of plywood. It's not even there anymore. So she serves there, comes in 1868. She's there until 1886, until she dies in a mysterious fire at the lighthouse. And to this day, there is a lot of question about what happened and whether her death was actually a murder. So it was March 5th. So yesterday was the anniversary of this. In the middle of the night, this is her bedroom. So she should have been here in the middle of the night, but when the fire was extinguished, they didn't find her remains upstairs. They found him in the basement, just inside this window, which is inside this door. And what they determined was one of the reasons that they think it might have been murder is that the door had been kicked off of its hinges. It just simply didn't burn off. The hinges had been ripped from the door frame as if somebody kicked it in. And the local legend is that someone kicked in that door in the middle of the night to break into the lighthouse to rob her of her money. She was known to keep her money in the lighthouse. She was considered extremely frugal. She owned other land in town as well. They think she heard that. She came downstairs, confronted the intruder in the basement. There was a struggle. She was killed, and the fire was started near her body to get rid of the evidence. Because there's no other reason she should have been down there at that time of day. So it remains this huge mystery. This is the story that actually prompted the writing of my book on death at the lighthouses, because it's considered an unsolved case to this day, and obviously never really will be solved. Michigan History Magazine even did a big article about it several years ago. And lots of newspaper articles. Every newspaper article that they have talks. Maybe it was the fire, but they talk about murder as a possible cause, robbery and murder as a advanced cause of her death. She was 69. All right, we're going to pop outside of Michigan briefly to the Apostle Islands in northwestern Lake Superior. This is accessible out of Bayfield, Wisconsin. We're actually taking a trip here at the end of June. Excited to go out there. And we're going to focus on Michigan Island. And this is where Anna Maria Carlson was there with her husband and keeper, Robert. And then they, at the time that they were there, which would have been in the late 1800s, early 1890s, I believe, they had 3 children, their daughter Cecilia and their twin boys, Robert and Carl. And they decided to stay out on the island for the winter. So if you were a lighthouse keeper on an island, an uninhabited island, you had the option when winter set in, if you wanted to try to stockpile food and ration everything and stay through the winter, or go stay, like they would go to Bayfield, Wisconsin for the winter, or Madeline Island, which was nearby, which was an inhabited island. And they decided that they were going to ride it out on Michigan Island. And I'm actually going to read to you from her words an article that appeared in one of the Detroit papers in the 1930s. And I read it. It's one of 2 readings I have tonight. Because she tells the story so much better in her own words. And she says, "We were trying a winter on Michigan Island where my husband was head keeper. His brother was assistant. When we decided to stay, our hired girl promised to remain with us through the winter, but she slipped ashore with some fishermen and didn't come back. One day, the men took the dogs and went fishing. I was always afraid to be alone on the island. As city-bred girl, the stark loneliness of it all was appalling. As soon as they left the house, I ran about and locked all the doors and windows. Yet there was nobody on the island but myself and the children, a little girl past 2 and the twin boys 9 months old. For a few hours after they had gone that day, I was busy setting the house in order. The tower was closed, but there was lots of work to do in the house, and I was glad for that. I got the children's lunch, prepared things for an early supper, as I knew the men would be hungry when they came home, and then I sat down to wait. I waited as the sun went down across the water, waited until its sickly yellowish light had disappeared and the stars came out. I kept stoking the fires, for I knew the men would be cold when they came in. I didn't even think of such a thing as them not coming. They had been gone since before daylight, and they would be home before 6, I was sure. The wind was blowing such a gale, but in my ignorance of such things, I gave it no thought. 6 o'clock came and darkness. It was so dark I couldn't even bear to look out the window, but I kept watching for the men and the dogs. It began to snow. 6 o'clock, and still my man had not come home. I put the children to bed and waited. All night long I sat by the fire, terror clutching my heart, but I could not believe that they would not come home. Every time the wind rattled the branches of the trees around the lighthouse, I would start up, expecting to hear my husband's voice. Morning found me on the verge of hysteria, but there was serious work to be done. I had to milk the cow because of the children, and I was afraid of the cow. Raised in Chicago, where one doesn't even think of such things, I had never learned to milk, even after coming with my husband to Michigan Island, where a cow and chickens provided the main food for the children. It was bitterly cold and still snowing. A winter fog shut us in. I went down to the barn and I looked at the cow. She swung her head and made a noise, and I know I could never milk her as I had seen my husband do. Running into the woodshed, I grabbed the axe and in desperation began chopping at the wall of her manger. I made a hole through which I could put both hands, and I started to milk into a little tin cup, which I held with one hand, milking with the other. So here's the wall. Her hands are through the wall so she can milk the cow. All right, well, desperate times, I guess. The cow kicked, and I jumped away, but the children had to have their milk. So back I went at it, and I kept at it until I had enough milk for them. I fed the cow and watered her and looked after the after the chickens. Then I went back to the house and waited. I waited and watched and somehow kept my reason through that terrible day and the more terrible night that followed. On the 3rd day, I could stand the house no longer. Leaving the little girl with the twins, I put on a hat and coat and I went down to the shore. Now, this is another lighthouse in this area, and I use it because I want you to see what we're talking about with the weather conditions. Probably what it looks like this year up there. I put on a hat and coat and went down to the shore. You don't know what the Michigan Island shore is in winter. Unbroken trails through the woods, ice hummocks barring the way, deep gulches of snow into which I stumbled. The bitter cutting wind from the lake lashing my face, and above all, the sight of that white expanse which was holding my husband from me. It seemed hours afterward that I came back to the house. The twins were sleeping in the cradle. Little sister was rocking them. As I closed the door, I fell to the floor screaming. I screamed at the top of my voice until I was exhausted, and still my husband did not come. That night I slept a little, and on the fourth day the weather had cleared, but it was still bitterly cold. I went about the house in a daze. The same chores had to be done. The children had to be cared for. How I hated Lake Superior. I was doing some task about the kitchen that afternoon when I heard my husband's voice. I'm all right, Anna, he said. Don't be afraid. The next moment I was in his arms, sobbing and laughing in real hysterics. My husband told me he had been afraid to come in first without calling to me. The two men apparently had drifted to Madeline Island when the ice broke up. So they were on the edge of Michigan Island. When the gale came up, it started the ice that they were on into Lake Michigan with them on it. And by night, the floe upon which they were riding with the dogs pushed up against Madeline Island. That night, they had walked and jumped from floe to floe until their shoes were almost off their feet and the feet of the poor dogs were bleeding. On the island, they found some flour in a fisherman's shanty, some dry wood and kindling, and after building a hot fire, they boiled that flour into some sort of gruel, and that is all that they had to eat during the time they were on the island. On the beach, they found an old boat, and in the shanty were oakum and pitch, and they patched and cooked that boat and rowed 8 miles across stormy waters back home to Michigan Island. She says, we never tried living on any of our island homes through the winter after that experience, as you can imagine. So that transcript I've had for about 25 years, but a few years ago, thanks to newspapers.com, I was able to find the PDF of that. So this is what it was, the whole section of the paper and then some on the inside talking about that experience. So after this, the Carlsons end up at Marquette. Then they spend 30 years of their life at Whitefish Point, which is where they retire. Here they are with their granddaughters, Bertha and Robert, the children of their daughter, Cecilia. We're going to back up real quick over to Berg Island, which is known as Rabbit Island off of the eastern coast of the Keweenaw. They had a woman there who was an unofficial keeper of an unofficial light. Her name was Henrietta Berg. She's right here. Her husband was a local fisherman. And when he would go fishing at night, he would have her put a lantern in the window, the bedroom window, so that when he was coming back at night, he knew how to get home. Well, all the other fishermen in town were like, hey, Henrietta, we're going fishing tonight. Will you put the light out for us? So she just started doing it all the time. So not an official light, not an official keeper, but certainly worth to be recognized. The family home in ruins out on Berg Island. There is a lighthouse further up on the Keweenaw called the Mendota Lighthouse, and it's privately owned. It sold a few years ago for about $500,000. The Marquette Lighthouse. So the Carlsons went here for a few years. This is one of the haunted lighthouses as well. But during the 1960s, Anastasia, who they also called Eliza, she served as the acting keeper while her husband Nelson was off fighting in the Civil War. The local Native Americans called her Mother of the Light. And in fact, I connected with one of her descendants about 20 years ago, and this is a letter that woman, Christine, had received from another member of her family telling all about the backstory of Eliza Truckee and how she ended up becoming the lighthouse keeper. Eliza and Nelson had a daughter named Frances. They called her Emma. And it is this story that Christine used for her historical novel about a teenage girl growing up during the Civil War at a lighthouse. So this is on your handout if you're interested. It's a hard book to get a hold of. All right, so we're down over to Lake Huron for our last few female keepers. This is Boblo Island, or Bois Blanc if you're French, and not to be confused with Boblo Island in Detroit. So Mackinac Island, this is Round Island where they have a lighthouse, and then Bablo Island, and the lighthouse sits way over here. And this was actually the lighthouse that's out there now is a newer light. The original lighthouse was built in the 1830s, and it was actually the second lighthouse built in Michigan. The first was Fort Gratiot in Port Huron. The original one was built 200 years ago. It was built in 1825. But what's interesting about Bablo Island was that they had this woman named Emily Ward. Her father was actually the acting keeper, and a bunch of his documents are at the Clark Historical Library at Central Michigan University. Her dad was a well-known Detroit businessman. Her brother was even more well-known. He was one of the early millionaires in Detroit. She was never married. They called her Miss Emily or Aunt Emily. Her mother died when she was young, and so she was the oldest, ended up raising her siblings. And then back in that era, there was a lot of what they called adopting out, where you might take on another child of a friend or family member if they are not able to provide for that, or if the parents of that original child died or whatnot. Kind of like with Elizabeth Whitney Williams, when her family would send them out to live with other people during certain times. So the Ward family was very famous because they had means to bring in other people to take care of those children. And she actually ran a children's school over in Marine City for a long, long time, called the Newport Academy. She has her memoirs also published in a cute little book, very similar to Elizabeth's, where it's like reads like Little House on the Prairie. And I'm going to do another reading from this. And the chapter should lend it to be where we're going with this. It's called When the Lighthouse Fell. She was in her 20s at the time that this incident happened. It was December of 1837. Michigan had not even been a state for a full year at this point. It was a wild night when the lighthouse fell. My father had gone over to Mackinac, the city, 2 days before, intending to come back the day he went. But a storm had arisen that prevented his getting back, and instead of decreasing, it had increased until in the afternoon it was blowing a perfect gale. The lighthouse had been originally placed too close to the water. The encroachment made by the winds and waves since it was built had washed away the bank of the lake to within 5 feet of the tower. And now every heavy storm was full of peril for the old lighthouse. My father had long anticipated the day when some extra heavy storm would sweep the waters around its foundation, loosen it, and beat its staunch tower until it should fall. Now that day had come. Bolivar, which was the little boy that they had adopted, Bolivar and I were alone in the house, and there was no one on the island but a Frenchman who was a great coward, and his Indian wife. Our house was very near the lighthouse, so near that should it fall in a certain way, it would fall upon the roof, and this made it a very unsafe dwelling for us. It was the day of great anxiety, for if the lighthouse should be blown down, its great light would be put out. I shudder to think of what might happen to the vessels and their crews and passengers. Eber was on the lake, her father. What if his boat, storm-driven, should look for that friendly light and not find it? My heart was like lead as I looked out upon the boiling waves, the roaring wind, and the driving clouds, and I thought of him. So I would not take down the lamps until the very last moment. Early in the forenoon, I had seen that the water surrounding the building. Later on, as the storm increased in violence, every great wave would dash itself to foam against its brawny sides. About 5 o'clock, I saw that if I were to save the lamps and the great reflectors, I must begin at once. So putting on a warm hood on my head to protect it from the rain, I started, first telling Bolivar not to stir from the house, but to stand at the window and watch for me. The poor child burst into tears and begged me not to go, but I thought it was my duty to protect the government property. I had no sooner got out of the house than the wind, with such a dash, nearly took me off my feet. The rain half blinded me, and the spray wet me through. I ran quickly, and in a moment I was in the lighthouse, climbing its 150 steep steps. That's a lot of steps. With all the speed I could. When I reached the top, what a magnificent sight met my gaze. Whoever has stood on a perilous height and seen the mad waters leap and roar and dash with all their mighty force against the frail structure that supported them can imagine the wild exaltation of soul that filled me through and through to the exclusion of all fear. It seemed as if then, indeed, God in his majesty was sweeping the earth and the seas, and I felt that I also was part of the great universe that existed under that awful power. I had but little time, however, to indulge myself in these thoughts, for every wave made the whole tower reel. It took all my strength to carry those great lamps and reflectors down the winding stairs. Sometimes when I would stop to take a breath and would hear the beat of the waters and feel the shock it gave the tower, it would give me a momentary spasm of terror. It would be but momentary before my work must be done, and I had no time for fear. I think I climbed those stairs 5 times before I got everything movable down. And each time Bolivar would implore me with tears streaming from his eyes not to go again, for I would surely be killed. But I told him I wouldn't be hurt, for when people are doing their duty, they aren't apt to come to much harm. After I had gotten everything down, I changed my wet clothes for dry ones. We ate our supper and then took our place by the window to watch for the lighthouse to fall. I told Bolivar that as soon as I said the word, we were to leave the house and go back into the woods, and that when that time came, he was to not speak a word, but to hang on to my hand tight and follow me, and he said he would. We had not long to wait. The night had come. The rain ceased, and the moon gave such light as scurrying and wildly driven clouds would permit. Suddenly, we saw a long zigzag line run from the tower's base to its top. Put on your overcoat and hat, I said to Bolivar. I put on my warm shawl and hood, and we stood by the window. Another line shot up and around, and the tower tottered. Now, I said, Bolivar, come. He took my hand, and we went out the back way, shutting the door behind us, and we ran for the woods a few rods off. We had scarcely got there when, with one mighty crash, down went the huge pile of masonry, and the waves washed over the place where the lighthouse once stood. We could see that the house had not been injured, so with thankful hearts we went back, and Bolivar was soon asleep in bed. But I could not sleep for thinking of the ships that were in peril, and especially of Eber. Tears that I could not restrain wet my pillow that night and succeeding nights. That storm was one of the most awful ever known on the lakes, and many ships went down and many lives were lost, but no one was lost near Bablo. Can you imagine going through that? And again, I could have told you that story, but to have her words was amazing. So when I was at Central back in October, I got a chance to go through some of the family documents, and this is the letter that was written by her father. Bablo Lighthouse fell on the night, and so he had written this letter a couple days later to the head of the Lighthouse division. So it's really kind of neat to see that whole transition. I went looking through newspapers.com. If it was the most dangerous storm of the era, you'd have thought there'd be articles about it, but I wasn't able to find any. Okay, so this is the old Presqu'île Lighthouse. This is over near Alpena. Presqu'île Township actually has 4 lighthouses. They have the old light, they have a new light, and they have a set of range lights that sit 1,000 feet apart. And there was like this family, the Garrity family, that reigned over these not like falling rain, but reigned over these lighthouses. So Patrick Garrity was the father. He served at all of the lights in the area. His wife, Mary, was assistant keeper at the new lighthouse. So they were the last family at the old light, the first family at the new light. And of their children, their sons, John, Thomas, and Patrick all served as keepers, but their 2 daughters, Anna and Kate, also were keepers. So mom and 2 of the daughters. So this is Patrick and Mary themselves. And they look like a good Irish family. The family is really big. There's a lot of descendants over there still. I've met several of them over the years. This is Ann Garrity. She never married. She lived in the range light. So this would have been the light at the on land, and then there was another shorter light out by the water. There's also a sculpture dedicated to her in that area. and then the sister Kate, and this is taken out at the new lighthouse. They figured out that the tower of the old light was sitting too far inland and it was too short, so they ended up building a taller tower a mile up the road. Lorraine Parrish here would have been one of our Paris would have been one of our more modern keepers from the 60s to the 90s, 1960 to 1990s. She and her husband took care of the museum at the old lighthouse. I gave multiple presentations over that way, and she would always be there, always wearing the same outfit. She passed away just a couple of years ago. She was, I think, 96. And then that's the new lighthouse there. That's near Alpena. Okay, so we have the Saginaw River Range Light. This is in Bay City. And Julia Braun came into this lighthouse in the 1860s with her husband, Peter, and then their teenage son, DeWitt. Shortly after they got there, Peter became bedridden. And so Julia, like some of the other women, stepped into that role, took charge of the light. She loved doing it. When Peter died, she was hired in officially as the keeper. She got married a few years later to a man by the name of George Way. They called it a scandalous marriage because he was 13 years younger than she was. How dare she, right? Shortly after the marriage, George, who had no experience as a lighthouse keeper, was put in charge and she was demoted. And then they abolished her position altogether. And I don't think she was very happy about that. Almost looks like one of those death photos, doesn't it? Kind of creepy. Well, interestingly enough, after she got demoted and had no job, that second husband died also. For years, I always speculated that she had something to do with it. But I did learn that one husband died of asthma-related incidents, and the other one had prostate cancer. So I'm pretty sure she didn't do either of those things. She still haunts the place today, though. So she's actually buried in Bay City between both of her husbands. How cozy is that? Point Out Barks Lighthouse is in Port Hope in the tip of the thumb. When it was originally built, the house and the tower were not connected, but today's more modern lighthouse is all one. Peter Shook was the keeper here until he died in a shipwreck in April of 1849. He was actually going from the lighthouse down to Port Huron with a local doctor, and the boat capsized and the men were lost at sea. Catherine, who had 8 children, was ultimately hired as the keeper. And then within 2 months of that position, there was a fire at the lighthouse in the house part, not the tower. And this is actually a copy of the letter from the lighthouse inspector who had been out there, basically saying that it was not her fault that there was a fire. There was a faulty chimney in the kitchen, and it resulted in that fire. And in there, they talk about how she's recently lost her husband to a watery grave, and that she is a young mother with 8 children and is in need of our help. So come out here, expedite your trip out here to fix the lighthouse to the house. And while you're at it, the tower's looking pretty shabby, so put another coat of paint on that while you're there. She is buried in New Baltimore. Peter was never found. His body was never found, but his name is on her headstone. And then our final light tonight, our final female keeper, is a lighthouse most people have never heard of. A lot of this information was from the Bacon Library. So there was an island called the Mama Judah Island in the Detroit River. It's right here. They believe the name came from a local Native American woman who lived in the area. And in Google Earth, you can kind of see the water levels have changed, but the island is still kind of underneath the water down there. And they had a lighthouse that was here. It was built, I want to say, in the 1860s. And as the lighthouse is no longer there, obviously the island no longer there either. So one of the noted keepers there was a man by the name of Barney Litigott. And this is the Litigott family. So I still have not found a photo of brother Saphariah, but John and Barney, and then their younger sister Mary. You could see here that John and Barney were Civil War soldiers. They went off to battle together in the same unit. John was killed during their first skirmish, but Barney did survive. Now, we'll come back to Mary's story in a second, but So before he went off to service, Barney had married Caroline Taylor. And then years after the war ended in February of 1873, he was appointed as the head keeper of the lighthouse. He died in 10 months. I'm not sure why, but at that point, Caroline, his wife, was appointed to serve in his as the keeper. Now, what's interesting about her story is not long after she got appointed, they fired her with no reason. And it created an outcry in the community, and people started writing letters to the lighthouse establishment demanding that she be reinstated. And it worked. They put her back in, and she ended up serving there until 1887. So it was interesting. You know, a lot of the stories that I go through, we had a lot of women who had the respect. You would think that there would be, like, the men would be upset about this, but they weren't. They protected them. They fought for them. They, like, with George Sheridan down in Saugatuck, when he went into the asylum and he wasn't getting paid, the local lighthouse keepers in the area took up collections for his wife so that she could feed their children. Like, they were really supported and protected in their industry, and this is another one of those examples. So I want to go back to the Litigott family again real quick here. So the 4 kids, when they were young, their mother passed away, and their father was a local farmer. And it was easy for him to deal with the boys. They were a little bit older, and a father with boys in the 1800s is manageable, but he didn't really know what to do with his daughter. So he adopted her out, as we've seen with some of the other stories tonight, to one of his farmer friends in the area so that him and his wife could take care of her. He still had a relationship with her until he died, but he just wasn't, you know, the primary caregiver for Mary. So during her time in that new home, Mary befriended a gentleman who worked at that farm, and he ended up buying his own farm, proposed to her, and they got married. And that man's name was William Ford. And their firstborn was Henry Ford. So Henry Ford's aunt was one of our female lighthouse keepers. And I have known about Caroline Litigott for years. And it wasn't until, like, during COVID, when we had lockdown and I had to cancel like 45 programs, I had a lot of extra time on my hands, and I will take that list because there's a lot of them I don't know about, like, other than their names on that list. And so I was going through them, trying to, like, Googling them, trying to see what would pop up. And all of a sudden, the Henry Ford has all this stuff about the Litigott family and the lighthouse keepers and all of this other stuff. And then they had already put all the pieces together for me that, hey, wow, this has ties to Henry Ford. So that's the number 2 connection with Henry Ford tonight. And so I have to go back because I think he was alive when his aunt and uncle were there. So I want to go back and see if they have any record of him ever being out at the lighthouse. You would think as inquisitive as he was about things, that might have been a possibility. So this is the other side of that handout. These are other books that you can check out or order that will have stories about our female keepers, the newest of which is called Ladies of the Lights by Pat Major. She used to run the Michigan Women's Hall of Fame, and she did a huge exhibit on female keepers, which is where I met her. She actually asked for permission to use my presentation title as her book title. So I gave her that. This is a great children's book about Elizabeth Whitney Williams at Little Traverse Lighthouse. I have that in my granddaughter's home library. There's also a children's book about Harriet Colfax in Michigan City, Indiana. And it's funny, my granddaughter will gravitate to these stories about real life people more than any of the other books that we have. She wants to know about all of those. And I do highly recommend A Child of the Sea. It is available to read online for free, not in a Kindle version, but if you Google it, somebody has actually put like a scanned PDF of the book up online. So if you are one of those people that can read things on your tablet or your phone, I cannot, but I highly recommend it because it is just such an insightful book into, the mid to late 1840s on up through her life at the lighthouses. These are my books. Michigan's Haunted Lighthouses, ironically, has 7 women in there. Wasn't kind of intended that way. It just kind of worked out. And a handful of women are tied to death in lighthouses on the Great Lakes as well. I have these available for this evening if anybody is interested in purchasing those. I'll even sign them for you at no extra charge. If you're interested in lighthouse history, these are some great resources for you to check out. The Great Lakes Lighthouse Keepers Association, which is based in Mackinac City. TerryPepper.com. Terry used to run the Great Lakes Lighthouse Keepers Association, and his website has a ton of information on it. And then the Lighthouse Research Catalog with the U.S. Lighthouse Society is another source that I use for a lot of my research. And with that, I'm going to wrap it up and take any comments or questions that you might have. Yes. Why is it called the Apostle Islands? I don't know the answer to that, but after I take a trip there this summer, I'll find out. Yeah. 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 No, it does. The names aren't, they don't match up with the apostles. No, but I'm super excited. We have a trip there in June, and then in September we're doing Isle Royale. So, like at the lodge, I'm not like carrying kayaks and stuff all the way through that island. I will go day hikes, but staying at the lodge for a few days. So. I've actually never been to Minnesota. Yeah. Yeah. I'm past the years of doing all that. Yes. You can do that. There are several places. So if you, yeah. So if you go to that Great Lakes Lighthouse Keepers Association website, the gllka.com, they have a tab that'll tell you which ones have keeper programs. But I know like Grand Traverse has one, Old Mission has one, Tawas Point has one, and they're looking for volunteers in East Tawas. Big Sable has one at Big Sable Lighthouse. You spend the night there for 2 weeks. Then they have ones at some of their other lights where you just stay in a hotel or whatever and you go to the lights. But Glicka has a whole list of those that's current, not just for Michigan, but for the whole Great Lakes. Right now, there's only one lighthouse bed and breakfast in Michigan, which is Big Bay Point Lighthouse up near Marquette and near that Huron Mountain Club. The other two were on the Keweenaw. One closed down when the owners got too old and sold, and the other one has been under construction, opening soon for like 10 years now. So who knows if that'll ever open back up. I have stayed at Big Bay once. I have not spent the night at any of the other ones. Although South Manitou, I had when I went out there 20 years ago. I stayed in the Coast Guard facilities, but I had the key to the lighthouse tower. And like when the boat went back at 4:00, the park ranger tossed me the keys to the lighthouse and just said, "Lock it up when you're done." So I sat up at the top of the tower all night long, and I went because it was haunted. Didn't have any ghost encounters, even after 2 bottles of wine and full a full moon. Well, it was a blue moon, so it's like a doubly potent full moon. It just made coming down that tower incredibly challenging at the end of the night. My knees were 20 years younger, so I could have done it then. I don't think I could do it now. I actually can't climb towers anymore. I get panic attacks when I go. So it's a weird hobby to have when I can't even go. Like Sandpoint, if you've been out there in Escanaba, where it's just a little bit, or White River Light Station, where you've only got like 10 or 12, I can do that. But those other ones, if I've got to go more than a dozen steps, there's no way. And I'm so afraid I'm going to get stuck at the top and then can't get my way down. And then I'm going to have to come down like on a backboard by the, rescue team or something. And I'm just like, all of it just freaks me out. So I just don't do it anymore. Well, thank you all again for coming out tonight. I really appreciate everybody being here and letting me share these stories.